Let's get back to that Mike Madigan story we were just talking about. Anthony was mentioning it here, but former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan asking the U.S. Supreme Court to hear his corruption case. About 3 months ago, the federal appeals court in Chicago upheld Madigan's February 2025 conviction. So joining me to talk about this case, Stephen Caliendo, a political science professor at North Central College. Thanks for being with us, Stephen.
Good to see you, Liz.
Absolutely. So let's talk about this here. How likely, I mean, the Supreme Court doesn't take up every case it hears. So how likely is the Supreme Court to actually take up this case?
You're right. And I think Anthony's inflection when he read the story a few moments ago hit it really well. It's no guarantee, and it's quite unlikely, in fact. The Supreme Court gets 5,000 to 6,000 petitions per term. And even in years where they were hearing a good number of cases, they were deciding about between 120 and 150. This court has decided far fewer. It was about half of that this last term. So it's quite unlikely, just in terms of the number of cases from which they have to choose. But I will say there's some interesting legal questions here, and so I would imagine that it'll raise the interest of a number of the judges, the justices, and their clerks.
You know, let's talk about that. You said some interesting questions. So what are some key deciding factors here?
You got to promise you're not going to laugh at me, Liz, because the way that these things are framed. The question is, what's corrupt? What does corrupt mean? So there were two main questions. One is corrupt, and then one is an official act. And I say you to laugh at me because it seems ridiculous.
Yeah.
Corruption is sort of like Justice Potter Stewart once said about obscenity. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it.
Exactly. It should be obvious, right?
It should be obvious. It feels like it's obvious. But I think what the Madigan team is asking here is to say, you know, politics is all about give and take. It's all about negotiation. It's all about doing something for someone. And the question is, how much of it was personal? On the corruption question, the question is, they're asking, did the speaker need to know? Did he have to have intent to have some personal gain? Or did he just have to... they're arguing he was just aware that ComEd was trying to garner favor with him. Well, of course they would be, because he's a very powerful state politician. They're arguing that he must have had some intention before it counts as corrupt. And so these are interesting legal questions that the court might want to wrestle with. But, you know, given the kind of things that you and I have talked about over the past couple of weeks what the Supreme Court decides, I'm not sure this falls into that category.
It is an interesting question, though. What is corruption? You got to define these things for sure, especially in a court of law. Now, let's switch gears, talk a little bit about Dr. Anthony Fauci. It sounds like a Senate committee will vote next week on whether or not they want to hold him in contempt for declining to answer questions yesterday. He invoked his Fifth Amendment right more than 100 times. So what are we learning from this testimony?
Well, we're not learning anything from the testimony, and that's typical of a lot of congressional hearings, that they're not really about the content. Some of them are. I don't mean to suggest that it's all performance. But, you know, if you go back to the 1980s when we first thought about putting cameras in Congress and C-SPAN sort of emerged on the cable news channels, part of the concern people had was that it would be mostly about performance. And that's certainly what we had yesterday. You had Republicans performing for a particular audience. You had Democrats performing in the opposite direction. And from Anthony Fauci's perspective, it's less about performance. It's about making sure that he wasn't entrapped in some way. That was the argument that the Democrats were making, that the Republicans were hoping to catch him in some falsehood or some confliction. So there's a lot going on here, but most of it is non-substantive.
So quickly, Stephen, does it imply he is guilty by not saying anything, by not answering questions?
No, absolutely not. And we should be clear, that's not just for Anthony Fauci, that's for anybody. The Fifth Amendment is very important. The framers understood that if you're going to take somebody's liberty, the burden is on the government to prove that you've done so. You do not have to help them to do that. So we should never infer any guilt when people invoke their Fifth Amendment rights.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Obviously that factor there. We appreciate that. And we appreciate having you this morning, Stephen.
It's good to see you. I hope you have a good day.
Good to see you, too. Thank you. All right. It is 8:49 on this Thursday morning. A beautiful one. We'll be right back.